In this video, I'm going to show you how to knit two at a time for flat pieces. If you want to learn how to knit two at a time in the round, I have a video for that too, and a link to it will be in the comments section below this video or in the tutorial around the video. To knit two at a time, you need either two separate balls of yarn like I have here, or you can work with one ball of yarn if you use the one end and then use the other end as your second yarn. That is perfectly fine too. If you have a piece that you can do both pieces with one skein of yarn, you might want to do it that way. So I am using two different colored yarns for this tutorial just to make it a little bit easier for you to understand. When you're working your own piece, you'll probably have matching colors. And you need a circular needle long enough to hold the number of stitches you're going to have for both pieces is the only requirement. Doesn't matter how long it is, just so it's long enough to hold your stitches. Now, to work two at a time, you cast on just like normal, whatever cast on you prefer. So I am using the knit cast on. But again, you can use any cast on, regular or provisional, for working two at a time. Cast on with one of your yarns, just like normal. And I am demonstrating this in the continental style of knitting, but don't fret over that. No matter what style of knitting you do, this video will work for you because I am not focusing on how you form the stitches, but rather how you manipulate the pieces to do two at a time. Okay, I got 10 stitches on there. And I'm just going to slide that down onto the cord, and I'm going to grab my other yarn and cast on for the second piece. So some of the reasons why I like knitting two at a time is that you are more likely to have both pieces turn out identically. So you'll often find this useful when you're doing sleeves. That's a great project to try this on to begin with. If both sleeves are done identically, that would be a great first kind of two at a time project, if you will. You can also do it for your left and right sweater front. That's a little more complicated because oftentimes you have increases and decreases and they're opposite on the two pieces. And that can get confusing. So you may not want to start with that, but you certainly can work up to it. So once you have your two casted on, I'm gonna call the tan one my first piece and my pink one my second piece. It could be your left sleeve and your right sleeve, or your left front, your right front, whatever. You just have to remember which piece is which when you're doing it on your own, if they are not identical. If they are identical, it's not as big a deal. Now, once I get casted on, I like to pin a stitch marker at the beginning of the first piece. So I'm getting ready to start the first row, so I'm going to pin it over here. And that's just going to help me keep track of where I'm at as I'm knitting two at a time, because what we are going to do is we are going to knit across the first piece, which would be row 1, and then drop that yarn, pick up the yarn for the second piece, and knit across that for row 2. And then we're going to turn it, knit across the second piece that'd be row 1, knit across the second piece row 2, and then knit across the first piece row 2. So you're kind of splitting the first piece in half because you're going to knit row 1 of the first piece, then you're going to knit row 1 and row 2 of the second piece, and you're going to come back and do row 2 on the first piece. I'm going to demonstrate that for you here, and I'm just going to do the knit stitch because, again, you're just going to do whatever stitch is in your pattern. This is not about the stitches, but rather about how to handle the pieces to accomplish the two at a time. Some of the other reasons I like two at a time is that you don't have to keep as many notes. For example, if you're knitting sleeves and you're doing increases or decreases in your sleeve, or a pattern starts and stops somewhere in your sleeve, you probably want to notate what row number those things happened on so that you can do the exact same thing in the other sleeve. Whereas if you're knitting two at a time, you don't have to notate that because you're going to do it on the row in your first piece, and then you're going to do it on that same row on your second piece right away. So now I've finished knitting across my first piece. I'm just going to slide it down on the cable and bring my second piece up, and I'm going to knit the first row of that one. The other reason I like 2 at a time is you get both pieces done at the same time. You have no second sock syndrome with knitting 2 at a time. You get both pieces done at the same time. There are some complications with knitting 2 at a time, though. It does take more concentration. You need to remember which row and which piece you're working on. So now I've finished row 1 of both pieces, and I'm going to turn and knit row 2 of the second piece. Tracking which row you're on can get confusing, especially like if you're trying to do this in conversation, or if you're watching TV and it's kind of a mindless knit. Sometimes you can kind of forget where you're at, and it can be hard to figure out where to pick up. So now I've knit across the second row of the first piece. I'm going to slide that down on the cable, and that was my second piece, sorry. And now I'm going to knit the second row of my first piece. I do encourage you not to stop right there when you're between pieces, and I will show you why in just a minute. It's also complicated, as I kind of mentioned earlier, to do at the same time instructions when you're doing 2 at a time, like on a sweater front. If you have to shape the neck and the armholes at the same time, your left and rights pieces are going to be opposite, which is a lot to keep track of. So now I've got 2 rows done on both pieces, and I'm ready to start the third row on this piece, on the first piece. Now, I want to show you, you can see my tails. I can wrangle my needle and all my tails and my working yarns here. All right. Here are my needles and my cord. And here is the working yarn for the first piece, and here is the working yarn for the second piece. It's pretty obvious which one I have to knit here, because even if I slide these to the other end of the needle, I am not going to have a working yarn at the tip. This working yarn is not at the tip, it's in the middle. I can't get to a tip. This working yarn is at the tip of my needle. So it's pretty obvious that I need to start here, which is why I encourage you to go to the end of the row on both pieces before you stop, because now I'm going to knit across this one and show you what happens if you start in the middle of if you stop in the middle of the row. It is a little bit harder to keep track of where you're at when you're knitting pieces 2 at a time that are the same on both sides, like garter stitch or ribbing or seed stitch. It's a little bit easier to keep track if you're doing like stockinette stitch, where one side is different from the other side. Okay, so now I've knit across row 3 on the first piece only. And when you stop, I'm going to call it mid-row, but because I've only done row 3 of the one piece rather than both pieces, so I'm calling that mid-row. What happens when you stop mid-row, regardless of whether it's on a front side or right side row or a wrong side row, you're going to have both working yarns at a needle tip. And if you've not been concentrating because you've been watching TV or you've been in discussion and you've put it down and you've forgotten, oh, did I do a right side row or did I stop in the middle of a wrong side row? I can't remember which piece to pick it up on. You're going to have to go and count your rows in each piece, and the one that has one fewer row is the one you need to knit. So you can see here I've got 2 rows on this one, kind of 2 garter ridges on this one, but only 1 garter ridge on this one. So this piece is shorter, so I know I have to knit this one. And the same thing I'll show you on the way back will happen if you stop in the middle of a wrong side row. One of the other things about this is that your yarns will get twisted. It's just something you need to know and deal with. So now I'm at the end of the first row, and again, I have one working yarn right here, which is not at a needle tip, and I have one here that is at a needle tip. So I know that I need to turn and work back on my second piece here, because that's the only yarn that's at the needle tip. So now I'm going to work back row 4, which is a wrong side row, and I will stop halfway in between, just to show you that it is the same. And even if I was doing stockinette where the back looked different from the front, it's still hard to tell when you stop mid-row like this and you've got both yarns at a needle tip where to pick it up at. You need to see which one has more rows. That's the one you've just finished, and the one with fewer rows is the one you need to knit. So I also mark the beginning of my row here because it does help me visually. Sometimes as you get used to this a little bit more, it's a little bit easier to remember where you were at with that little visual aid right there. One of the other things I like to do, let me show you these pieces that I have further done. Here I've got a white and an orange one. And I have my beginning of the row marker, and I like to pin it on the right side of my work, especially if I'm doing like garter stitch or ribbing where the right side and the front and the wrong side are not so obvious. I like to pin my beginning of the row marker on the right side of my work. But I also, if I have a pattern in my work, and in this one it's not much of a pattern, I just have this garter stitch border, but I still mark it because otherwise sometimes I forget and I just purl right through it rather than knit it. At any rate, I like to use one color marker for one piece and a different color marker for the other piece. That also helps me to kind of at a glance track where I'm at in my knitting. I do a lot of TV knitting, so sometimes I get a little absorbed in the TV show and I'm just kind of knitting and knitting and knitting and knitting away, and I'm like, oh my gosh, where was I? Or something, I get distracted by the TV and I kind of lay it down on my lap for a little bit. Those having one color marker on one piece and a different color marker on the other piece just helps me to very quickly remember where I was when I took my little break. Okay, so you will knit across the first piece, then knit across the second piece, then you'll turn it, and in this case I'll mostly purl across the second piece and then work across the first piece and turn it, and you'll just keep going that way. You'll work across the first piece, drop your yarn, pick up the yarn for the second piece, work across it, then you turn, and the wrong side row you work across the second piece first and then the first piece, and that gets you back to the beginning of a right side row. I have more explanations for this and photos in a tutorial. The link, if you're watching this on YouTube, is in the comments section.